November 1944. A civilian hospital in a town near Metz, France. Cold rain beats against the dark windows of a stone ward. Inside, 94 patients lie in iron beds, shivering under thin wool blankets. There are no sounds of electronic monitors, only the heavy breathing of the sick, the soft crying of a child, and the low groans of men post-surgery. A doctor walks the stone corridor with a single candle, looking into empty wooden cabinets. Every shelf is bare. Every bottle of morphine is gone. Every bandage, every suture, and every unit of plasma has been stripped from the building. 3 patients have already died in the last 48 hours because the medicine cabinets are completely empty. General George S. Patton will soon discover this frozen hospital, and his response will change the priority of an entire army. This is the story of what happened when the Third Army entered a liberated French town and discovered that the retreating forces had stripped a civilian hospital of every single medical resource, leaving 94 helpless people to die in the dark. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what the war revealed when the walls came down. Dr. Mary Louise Dupont was 52 years old, born and raised in the historic town of Metz, and served as the civilian chief of the municipal hospital. She had spent her entire adult life practicing medicine in eastern France, surviving the first occupation and remaining at her post when the front lines shifted. Her hospital was her life. Her patients were her neighbors, her friends, and the children of her community. When the occupation forces arrived years earlier, she stayed to shield her staff from forced labor and to protect the medical compound from being turned into a military barracks. She had watched her country fall, her food rations dwindle to nothing, and her family disperse across the countryside. Yet she remained steadfast in her white coat. She knew every broken tile in the corridors and every name on the ward rosters. Her hands were raw from scrubbing reusable linens in freezing well water. She had sacrificed her health, her savings, and her safety to keep the institution running under the heel of an unyielding enemy administration. Now, she was down to her final defense, tending to nearly 100 helpless civilians, with nothing but grit and a microscopic cache of hidden supplies. Stabsarzt Werner Fuchs was a 38-year-old Wehrmacht medical officer from the university town of Heidelberg, Germany. He was a highly trained physician, educated in the rigid tradition of pre-war European medicine, but his medical ethics had been entirely overwritten by the demands of total war. He wore a perfectly tailored field gray uniform, unblemished by the mud of the retreat, and a polished leather belt that gleamed under the hospital lamps. His hands were clean, his fingernails trimmed, and his manner was cold and transactional. Fuchs viewed the civilian population not as human beings in need of care, but as a secondary logistical burden on the Reich. To him, the Geneva Convention was an administrative luxury that vanished the moment a retreat was ordered. He believed that a German soldier's life was worth 1,000 French civilians, and he acted on that belief with a cold, systematic precision that no ordinary combat troop could match. By late autumn of 1944, the German military machine in France was in a state of rapid and chaotic retreat. The American Third Army, under the aggressive command of General George S. Patton, was driving relentlessly toward the German border, smashing through defensive lines and forcing the enemy out of long-held strongholds. In their wake, the retreating German forces frequently resorted to a scorched earth policy, destroying infrastructure, blowing up bridges, and stripping local communities of anything that could be used to sustain the war effort. This desperation created an environment of lawlessness and extreme deprivation for the civilian populations left behind in the combat zones. Broken supply lines, destroyed electrical grids, and a total collapse of local governments left towns entirely isolated. In many sectors, advancing Allied units routinely encountered stripped towns, but the targeting of medical facilities was something most tactical commanders had rarely seen on this scale. While previous occupation forces had seized vehicles or food stocks, the systematic looting of an active civilian hospital went far beyond standard military requisition. Other Allied officers often let minor resource seizures slide during the chaos of the advance, choosing to focus strictly on military objectives, rather than investigating every instance of local theft. They viewed the loss of civilian property as an unavoidable consequence of a rapid retreat. The emergency at the Metz facility, however, was not a matter of incidental collateral damage. It was a calculated logistical execution that directly threatened nearly 100 human lives. The American columns were pushing into the outskirts of the town, unaware that their first assignment would not be securing a perimeter, but dealing with a medical catastrophe. An American advance team from the Third Army entered the main administrative office of the facility early that morning. A captain walked through the door first, his boots clicking on the damp stone, followed by two armed sergeants. Stabsarzt Werner Fuchs sat calmly behind a large oak desk, reviewing paper ledgers while a German orderly packed wood crates in the corner. The American captain stopped in front of the desk and looked at the packing crates. "We are securing this facility for immediate civilian triage," the captain said. Fuchs did not look up from his ledger. "This facility is under my medical jurisdiction until the final evacuation is complete," Fuchs said. The captain stepped closer, placing his hands on the edge of the desk. "Your jurisdiction ended when your infantry withdrew from the perimeter," the captain said. "My men just toured the wards. The medicine cabinets are completely empty. Where are the drugs?" "They have been loaded onto the transport trucks in the courtyard," Fuchs answered, closing his book with a dull thud. "You have nearly 100 French civilians in those beds," the captain said, his voice tightening. "There are women in labor and children with acute infections. You cannot strip an active hospital." Fuchs leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cuffs. "All medical materials are to be transferred to Wehrmacht medical stores," he said. "Civilian requirements are secondary to military necessity." The hospital pharmacist stood by the door, tears visible on her face. "I begged you yesterday to leave just the antibiotics for the children," she said. "German soldiers need them more," Fuchs replied, his tone remaining flat and detached. "It is a matter of administrative priority." The captain looked at the weeping pharmacist, then turned back to the German doctor. "This violates the basic tenets of your medical oath," Captain said. "You are leaving these people to die without pain medication or basic care. The laws of war dictate that a military unit must preserve its own fighting strength at all costs," Fuchs said, standing up to adjust his iron cross. "The civilian population is the responsibility of the occupying power, which is now you. If they die, it is a failure of your logistics, not my directive." The American captain realized this went far beyond a standard military dispute over captured supplies. He looked at the orderly, nailing the final crate shut, then looked back at the unbothered German physician. "Stand down and remain in this room," the captain ordered. He turned on his heel and walked out into the corridor to find a field telephone. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up directly to the stone entrance of the compound, the heavy tires crunching over scattered masonry and frozen mud. 4 silver stars gleamed brightly on his helmet, and the signature ivory-handled revolvers rested in the holsters on his belt. He walked into the administrative office unannounced, his heavy boots making a sharp, deliberate sound on the stone floor. Every person in the room instantly froze, the sergeant snapping to attention as the general studied the scene before him. He did not raise his voice, but the sudden silence in the room became absolute. Patton looked at the wooden crates, then turned his gaze to the German physician. "Are you the medical officer who signed the requisition order for these supplies?" Patton asked. "I am," Fuchs replied, standing straight and refusing to look down. "Did you order the removal of every bandage, every dose of morphine, and every unit of blood plasma from the civilian wards?" Patton asked. "I did," Fuchs said. "Are you aware that 3 civilian patients have died since you stripped those cabinets?" Patton asked. Fuchs adjusted his collar. "I am aware of the casualties, but military necessity dictates our choices," he said. Patton walked slowly around the desk, his eyes locked on the German officer. "You are a trained physician," Patton said. "You spent years learning how to preserve human life. Yet you used your signature to turn a functioning hospital into a slaughterhouse. You stood in these corridors and watched women and children suffer while your men loaded life-saving medicine onto trucks. You told a grieving pharmacist that German soldiers needed those supplies more than dying infants. You think your uniform and your military regulations shield you from the basic obligations of humanity, Patton continued. You hide behind the phrase military necessity to justify an act of outright theft that has already cost 3 lives. You believe that because you are retreating, the consequences of your cruelty will vanish into the mud of this front line. You are mistaken. Your own requisition paper remains on this desk, and it will be preserved as evidence for a war crimes prosecution, Patton said. But those 91 patients upstairs cannot wait for a courtroom. They need a doctor who understands the value of a human life, and they need one right now. You have a choice. You can unpack every single ounce of medicine yourself, under the guard of my sergeants. Or you can face the immediate alternative. Decide now. Fuchs looked at the iron cross on his chest, then at the general, remaining completely silent. The German officer looked at the heavy handles of the wooden crates, his jaw tightening as he realized no reinforcements were coming to save his dignity. Under the sharp, unblinking gaze of the American sergeants, Fuchs slowly reached down, gripped the rusted metal crowbar, and began to pry open the heavy lids. The screech of pulling nails echoed through the stone room. One by one, the crates were forced open, revealing the neatly stacked rows of life-saving medical supplies. Fuchs was forced to lift every single carton himself. He hauled the heavy glass bottles of morphine, the sterile units of blood plasma, the packs of clean sutures, and the crates of antibiotics out into the damp hallway. His tailored gray uniform quickly became stained with dust and sweat, his breathing growing ragged as he worked under the silent supervision of the guards. A crowd of local civilians and hospital workers gathered along the edges of the corridor, watching in absolute silence as the man who had stripped their clinic was forced to rebuild it with his own hands. For 4 consecutive hours, Fuchs carried the heavy loads up the concrete stairs, his boots slipping on the wet floor, returning every stolen item to the empty cabinets until his hands bled, and his knees trembled under the physical weight of his own calculated cruelty. Dr. Marie-Louise Dupont remained at her post in the hospital near Metz, long after the front lines shifted toward the German border, spending the rest of her long career serving the medical needs of her local community. She worked in the same stone corridors for another 24 years, helping to rebuild the regional healthcare system from the ground up after the divisions of the occupation. She retired quietly in the spring of 1968, revered by generations of local families, and passed away peacefully in her sleep at her home in Metz in 1974. The hidden laundry room wall where she successfully preserved those vital resources during the darkest hours of the retreat was later designated as a local historical landmark, marked by a simple bronze plaque honoring her resourcefulness. Stabsarzt Werner Fuchs was taken into custody by American military police immediately following the arrival of the 3rd Army Medical Units. He was transferred to a secure detention facility in Western Europe and was subsequently tried before an Allied military tribunal for violations of the laws of war regarding civilian populations. His signed requisition document, which Patton had ordered preserved, served as the primary evidence of his deliberate orchestration of the hospital looting. He was convicted and served 12 years in a federal prison before being released in 1957. He returned to West Germany, where he lived out his remaining years in complete obscurity, never returning to the medical profession, and died in Heidelberg in 1982. General George S. Patton kept a detailed copy of the Metz medical report inside his personal desk for the remainder of the European campaign, referencing the incident in a private letter to his family later that winter. He noted that the true measure of an army was found not only in its ability to break defensive walls, but in its speed to repair the human wreckage left behind by a desperate enemy. Some historians have argued that the treatment of the German medical officer was a violation of standard military protocol regarding prisoners of war, suggesting that battlefield commanders should not impose immediate physical labor on captured personnel before a formal legal review. They contend that the rapid advance of the front line created administrative chaos where local resources were inevitably caught in the crossfire of moving armies. Others have argued the opposite, defending the action as a necessary and immediate response to an unfolding humanitarian crisis, where the preservation of 91 lives overrode any concern for an officer's rank or convenience. What is certain is that the preserved requisition order became a foundational document for subsequent legal proceedings, proving that the systematic stripping of civilian infrastructure during a military retreat was a prosecutable violation of the rules of engagement. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have forced the German doctor to personally return the stolen medicine? Or would you have simply turned him over to the military police? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what the war revealed when the walls came down, make sure to subscribe.